Students, today we're going to be talking about India under British colonialism. And as we have seen many times in Asian history, we talk about Britain so much, everything dealing with the Middle East and all of those different countries, and now we're coming back to them once again. So as just a little introduction to this concept, especially within this time period, Great Britain or Britain really has a huge hold on the world, especially in the 19th century. And India is one of those extremely important places that Britain sees as lucrative. They see it as a place that can be exploited. They want to put up their capital interests there, and they have a lot of success in doing so. Unfortunately, this time period of the interaction between these two countries has a huge impact on ultimately what happens to India, and the effects are still felt today. And we're really talking within this time period. I put about, that's a symbol means about 1757 to 1947. But these years are going to be a little bit fluid, and you'll see what I mean by that whenever we look through this lesson. So to give a good idea of where things stand in the world, this is, if you can see it, it's called the Imperial Federation, the British Empire in 1886. So we see on here, we see Britain on top of the world, right? Everybody looking at them from all of the different sides, some people sitting down. Look at all this different imagery, right? Looking at the center of the world, essentially Britain. If we look on the map too, we see many other possessions. We see Canada, parts of Africa, Australia, and then the one that we are particularly thinking about now, which is India. And India has a lot of wonderful resources that the British and other European powers consider to be highly lucrative. And we're going to see how they really parse out all of those different things, and Britain especially becomes the one to put their stake there and really take a lot of power over that piece of land. So we'll see in this video in step 2, we're just going to watch from 341 to 1039. It's a longer video. I just wanted to cut out some of it. And I want to identify and submit 6 ways European, especially British powers, exploited India during colonization.
To be made. So let's wind back the clock 200 years to see what those wily Europeans had been up to in the meantime. After Vasco da Gama realized you could sail on...
They really start here around 1500, just to give you some context of Europe's really rise to power technologically and how they really made these advancements around the world. So this is about 1500, which they start the video.
Underneath Africa, without no clipping off the edge of the map, Portugal became the first European power to reach the coast of India. During the 1500s, they built 24 coastal and island forts around the peninsula and developed a robust system of extorting innocent merchants for protection money. Their actual imports consisted of
Portuguese, right? They mentioned there, extorting merchants. That's one way they exploited India during this period of time.
Mostly Indian pepper, since it was very expensive for how little cargo space it took up. But all that aside, Portugal's presence in the Indian Ocean wasn't much more than a passive annoyance, since the Mughals were able to smack them around if they ever tried to muscle inland. India might not have seen much of a change, but Portugal carted back...
This is whenever the Mughal Empire is particularly prominent within India.
A mountain of ill-gotten treasure, and other European seafarers wanted their turn on the carousel of cash. So, in the early 1600s, the English, Dutch, and French created private companies dedicated to exploring and extorting the East Indies. By 1700, France, Britain, and the Netherlands had their run of the Indian Ocean because the Mughals didn't have a navy to speak of even before they nosedived into irrelevance. This power vacuum made the Europeans bolder, and in a classic case of, well, if someone is going to conquer this place, it might as well be me, they started throwing hands about it. This came to a head in the 7 Years' War between technically everyone, but really England and France. Despite the request of King and Parliament to not build a land empire in Asia, the British East India Company saw too much potential profit to let their power slip. So they rolled up to the French allied state of Bengal, usurped the king, and annexed the
East India Company is going to be huge throughout this video. They'll sometimes abbreviate it as EIC.
entire state. Yikes. In the following decade, Britain's victory in the not 7 years long 7 Years' War let them push France out of India, and by 1800 the East India Company was well on its way to subduing the entire subcontinent. The British Empire had, again, politely requested that the EIC not colonize one metric Europe, but it was way too easy. The company had a private army of 250,000 Indian soldiers on the payroll, and they had a lot of success in playing small Indian states against each other.
So India was quite fractured at this time, and the East India Company, who was growing in popularity because of their private capital interest, they were able to hire the soldiers. They were able to get the muscle necessary to really grow in popularity, all coming from really capital venture.
Sometimes they didn't even need to fight when a well-placed bribe would get the job done. So the conquest cost a pretty penny, sure, but it was almost entirely consequence-free. Ah, corporate geopolitics. The stuff of nightmares. Now, beyond simply extracting tolls from trade and bringing all those good silks and spices back to Britain, the company upgraded to tax collecting.
So that was two ways. They mentioned taxes there, but they also mentioned taking out the resources from India, things like spices, which Britain and other European countries were super high on at the time. They really wanted those spices, and so they'd take these resources and they'd move them, they'd take them away to Britain to where they could be exported elsewhere for profit.
They also owned the land, so the EIC shifted agriculture away from dumb, low-margin stuff like food to focus on cash crops like cotton, and starting in the 1820s, tea. While early company governors had ruled indirectly by way of vassal princes and at least pretended like they wanted to treat the native Indians fairly, the mid-19th century saw all of that go away. The company dismissed the native princes, forced the farmers into tenancy, and put tradespeople out of work by shifting production to the industrial factories in Britain. But it's all...
That's huge. That's kind of like the 19th century version of like outsourcing, right? So they're seeing a lot of the people who would be benefiting from it, the Indians within India who would be profiting from it. A lot of that stuff is really being outsourced elsewhere. So it's not really going to the people of India. It's going to people who would benefit from the trade with Britain.
Okay, the East India Company stockholders were seeing a really great return on their investment. So it's worth it. Priorities. Now, if you were, say, a native Indian steadily watching your rights erode as your absentee overlords drained your land of everything it's worth, this was enough to ruin the mood. But in the 1850s, life got even harder for the legions of Indian sepoys fighting in the EIC army. They faced religious discrimination, pay cuts, no promotions ever, and the increasing sense that white British officers were never going to take a dark-skinned person seriously. Meanwhile, local lords had their lands confiscated on ever more dubious grounds, and in 1857, a rebellion of one sepoy garrison quickly set off a slew of revolts across North India in an attempt to give Britain the boot. The company met this unrest with characteristic extreme brutality and massive destruction to farmland, which combined...
Again, that exploitation in those ways, I guess that's just straight up physical violence, right, to maintain their power. But the 1850s is really whenever it feels like Great Britain has taken a complete hold on the Indian land.
For a body count in the hundreds of thousands. At this point, Queen Victoria and friends decided that the EIC had lost its existing privileges, so the company was dissolved and control of India passed directly to the British Crown. From 1858 onward, the British Raj nominally made life better for Indians with the creation of an Indian civil service and the partial recognition of sovereignty to a series of princely states, but in reality, the Raj was just a more official system of wealth extraction and racial oppression that had been going on for over a century. British advisors had final say over the independent principalities, and participation in the Indian civil service was limited to candidates who could take an entrance exam in London.
So native Indians in India having a say over their land would have had to go through British filters to be able to have those access to the civil service jobs who would make those decisions.
tells you a little bit about who they wanted running the place. And this contributed to a revealing double standard of how Britain and India viewed the empire, or, Britain and anyone else for that matter. In London, you'd see the fruits of humanistic multiculturalism in food, art, demographics, and mind-numbing economic power. But back in India, it just looked like some domineering colonizers came to take the shiny stuff and stomp on the rest to satisfy a racist power trip. Naturally, this led leading Indian politicians and thinkers to consider the potential joys of not being oppressed, and in 1885, the Indian National Congress pushed to give Indians a greater voice in their own government, but Britain's counteroffer was that they would get nothing and like it, a shockingly effective negotiating tactic thus far. Now, at this point, it seemed like there was no way this finely tuned system of colonial exploitation could possibly come undone, but we've got to remember that this whole enterprise was a cash grab, so if India ever stopped being profitable, why keep it? And nothing will sink a profit margin faster than a good old-fashioned world war, better yet, two of them. When war struck in 1914, the Raj supported the Entente against the Central Powers with supplies and soldiers. This got a little awkward when Indians heard the British propaganda calling World War I a fight for democracy, as they could be forgiven for not realizing that Britain was into that. So it became harder to reinforce the post-war same old after India sacrificed so much for Britain's war. In World War II, Deutschland Boogaloo, India provided 2.5 million soldiers, loaned some £10 million to the British government, and provided critical supplies at tremendous cost to India itself. To make matters worse, Britain went all scorched earth on their own province of Bengal to deter the Japanese Empire from muscling into eastern India, and 3 million people died in the resulting famine. And our old pal Winnie Churchill remained fiercely imperialist throughout the end of the war, offering only the most flaccid concessions of greater Indian sovereignty. But by 1945, London was cleaning up a metric blitz, the empire was bankrupt, and Indian leaders like Gandhi were intensely campaigning for independence. So Britain cut their losses by just letting India go. Still not the least bit interested in India's actual well-being, the British Viceroy organized a partition and complete dissolution of the Raj in just 5 months. The government had 1 semester of college to draw new borders and fully withdraw. The basic idea was to make a Hindu-majority India and a Muslim-majority Pakistan, but demographics don't work like that, so after partition in 1947, there were millions of people that found themselves on the wrong side of these new borders. This ensuing mass migration quickly devolved into extreme violence and produced an animosity between India and Pakistan that endures to this day. Dark! So, that wraps up our history of India and also now Pakistan and Bangladesh. For many reasons...
Cool. So make sure you submit 6 ways European, especially British powers, exploited India during the colonial period or colonization. So they mentioned a few different things in that wrap-up. And you're going to be able to look into one of 2 options. So for step 3, you're going to select between option A or B, and then notify me of your choice and whenever you're done with either choice. So you can, step A, complete the Sepoy Rebellion in one note. So this one looks at an Indian rebellion in 1857, really whenever Great Britain begins to take hold in India against the British East India Company. Or you can look into Gandhi in one note, and this activity looked closely at Gandhi's role in helping India gain independence from Britain. So whichever side of the conflict you find to be more interesting, you have 2 options here. And then what you're ultimately submitting is your response to step 2, and then your choice of 3A or 3B. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful day.